This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to the 49th episode of the Practice of Learning Teams podcast show. On today's show, Brent Robinson and I spend time with safety mythologist and historian Carsten Busch. Carsten is the Indiana Jones of safety and the author of works such as Heinrich, Safety Myths 101, and If You Can't Measure It, Maybe You Shouldn't. This week, Carsten published his new book, The First Rule of Safety Culture, a counter C-word manifesto. Does the world really need another book about the C-word and safety being culture? Carsten would say no. His new book is about thinking critically about safety culture. Structured into 6 parts, the book covers safety culture discourse, approaches and applications through a critical lens. For example, whether we should see culture as a tool to fix something, or rather as the lens to study and understand. The book also tries to cover other useful and practical suggestions for different approaches, or at least different ways to think about these subjects. Warning: if you ever wanted to be a culture architect, hopefully you will think twice after reading this. So please sit back and enjoy this 2-part series as we discuss the C-word in safety with Carsten. Carsten, welcome to the show, the Practice of Learning Teams. It's great to have you, and it's been a long time coming.
Thank you.
Super excited that we're the first people to interview you on the day of the new launch of your new book, The First Rule of Safety Culture, a counter C-word manifesto.
Thank you, and excellent timing.
Yes, I'm sure that'll start a lot of conversations off, Carsten.
I really hope so. I also chose the cover intentionally to provoke some people about the socialism of safety and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're the Red Panther of Safety. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And tell me, what was the inspiration behind the book?
Yeah, well, it's a book that has been in the making, but not really making then, in the wait for about 4 years. Just after I wrote Safety Myth 101, I was already planning to do a follow-up. And I gathered material and I thought I have to write more about safety culture, especially because the culture word, it's so overused. And, well, I've been gathering material in the last 4, maybe even 5 years. And then this summer, there were some discussions on LinkedIn and other forums that just annoyed me so much. I thought, now I really have to write this book to do something about, well, at least to contribute to doing something about this culture babble.
Right.
And then, well, because I had so much lying around, the book almost wrote itself. I just had to, well, build some structure, and I think I succeeded nicely there. And then, yeah, write the stuff together and get it off my chest finally. So it was a great relief to do this.
I was going to say, so it's actually therapy.
It was a kind of exorcism, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a socialist, we've got exorcism, and we've got the C word.
Yeah.
You're going to get a lot of fan mail.
Yeah.
I really hope so.
You'll be very busy.
That's fantastic. And in particular, I like where you talk about that link about whether we should see culture as a tool to fix something, or rather than a lens to study and understand. What's sat behind that?
Well, that's the 2 main directions in the safety culture study that have emerged over the last decades. And I think, well, it wasn't even Frank Guldemond who came up with it. I've forgotten the name now of the scientist who first coined it. But Frank Guldemont, in his doctoral thesis, he discusses these two main directions: the functionalist approach, where people see culture as something that they can form and create and use as a tool to achieve organizational goals.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to say traditional approach where the whole culture concept comes from anthropology and sociology, where they look at the community or a group and then use the cultural lens to study that group.
Mm-hmm.
Which sees culture as something to describe stuff that you see, not as something to manage or and that's the main difference. Do you see it as a lens, as something to explain stuff, like for example Diane Vaughan did when she studied NASA after the Challenger crash? She loses the culture word a lot, and then she uses it as a lens. She doesn't necessarily make recommendations on you should transform the culture or something, I think.
Right.
And then you have the common approaches that say, you have a really bad safety culture, as the investigation for Chernobyl, for example, which concludes the safety culture was weak or lacking, or how they phrased it, and Texas City is one, and there are many other investigations, and then people start to fix the culture, and that's the functionalist approach.
So, do you see culture in this sort of corporate context is very temporary in my mind, because it's about whoever the leadership is at that time and what they sort of invoke. So that's why I find culture an interesting word, because I'm not sure how that rolls out, because I've been in organizations or around organizations that have had I'm not talking about from a safety perspective, but say an innovation culture they would say they have. And then the leader leaves and it just vaporizes it changes, it forms a new version of itself.
Yeah, I agree. Culture is at the same time it's temporary, as you say, and then it's continuous, because it never starts. It just is there, and then it changes constantly due to leadership, due to new technology that is introduced, due to external factors that are beyond your powers. Yeah. Like all our organizational cultures have changed the last year because we were sent home and work from home. That does something with your culture.
Yes,
because people interact in different ways. Culture is something, I said culture doesn't start, but culture does start. Because when we three should start an organization and we start working together, there will emerge something between us that is our culture. And when we change the way we interact, if I would move to New Zealand and we would meet physically, we would interact in different ways than through Zoom or Teams or whatever tool we use. So
yes, it's always morphing. It's that collective morphing. It's that sort of tribal component that's changing. That sounds really good. And I like the fact that you talk about the use of a word of a lens, because we talk about that a lot within learning teams. So we talk about things that safety differently talks about this concept of work as imagined and work as done, and what we always talk about is that how the lens that the worker has around work as imagined or work as done is very different to the lens of the organization, and then the lens of that work team, of that work group, of those groups, is actually different again.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talk about is the fact that it's important that people can see things through a different lens, because that helps them in being able to critically appraise something rather than simply evaluate it or assess it.
I totally agree. And this is, I think that's one of the core things of, let's call it the new view on safety. When I started nearly 30 years ago as a safety advisor, and maybe you too, I was trained in finding causes, finding the correct answer to something. And then as you move on and you develop, and well, I've been on the whole land trip, etc. Then you see or start to realize one version of a story is not enough to describe the complex situation you actually are seeing. You cannot capture a situation in just one narrative. Mm-hmm. You need different stories, and so you will need the worker's voice, and maybe you will need the version of his colleague, and you will need the version of a shift leader, and you will probably also need the version of the director, or maybe even an outsider. And then you get a better picture, and then you should realize you have never the full picture.
Just
maybe you should even have the machine's picture of the situation.
Yes.
How does the machine perceive that it is being worked with? But
or at least the designer's view.
Yeah. But the designer's view.
Yeah, because that's really interesting. Because I mean, I go back to it. I mean, that goes back to Risk Management 101. Which is to say that if you don't get the scope and the context of the criteria right early on, then that creates massive holes throughout your risk management life cycle. So if you don't go out and engage with the people who basically, either get exposed to the risk or help influence the risk, how can you ever sort of get to understand the risk at that point in time? Because it's always going to morph. It's always going to change.
Yep.
And at the moment, I think I've been working with a group of organizations lately, and we talk about that, risk management is part science and part art. And that if we think about the whole mode around continuous improvement, we did this piece of work that looked at Deming's original work. And everyone talks about, plan, do, check, and act. But he talked about plan, do, study, and apply. So how do we shift from study and apply to check and act? What happened? Why did it become such a sort of a binary function?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I haven't looked in it, but you see it in so many areas when a concept gets simplified in ways like this. That you get from the study the more reflective side of things, and then here is what's right, and you compare it to what's done, and then what's done it's wrong if it's not the same as what is prescribed. It's about speed. It's about it's probably some tailor is taking Deming and then applying the one best way idea to this.
When you were talking about when you started 30 years ago, I was thinking about my own journey was as an industrial engineer 30 years ago, and we used a stopwatch. And I came to the conclusion quite quickly that we'd come up with this new procedure of how people should do something. And then we're all surprised when they did it a different way. And you realize that it's always going to happen. People are either going to find a shortcut that's actually better because they're doing it every day. And my view is that there's no single black line. You've got to have some upper and lower control limits on either side of it that lets people move around safely, and your capacity has to be built into your system. And as I started off, we were trying to fix the people, and on that journey you change and realize that I went through the lean journey as well, and it brings you to a different point, that it is about the people that are right at the work face that understand and how they have to adapt every day. And if we don't take the time to understand that, we don't have a good picture of what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that leads back to what Deming talked about. that we have to understand the effect of change, and then learn for that change and improve from it. And that change can be seen as both as a threat and as an opportunity. Yet a lot of safety treats everything as a threat.
Yeah, well, it's the same what a lot of safety does with risk, because and hazard for that matter, because we want them and we need them. Like when I always use this example. I have a cup of coffee, and it's hot. And if you buy it in some coffee shop, you will probably get the cup where it says caution hot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I want it hot, and I want it bloody hot. Yeah. And I want it strong. It should give me heart arrest, as a matter of speak. I would complain if it was weak coffee and cold. The safest coffee you could get. We don't want safe coffee.
No.
We want coffee that keeps us awake, that tastes well, and we want cars that drive fast. And so we want the hazard, we want the risk, but we have to control it in some way.
Yeah.
And well, that's what you said, Brent. That you need this these limits. What is acceptable, and within those, you can vary.
Yeah.
So if we use that, we call it the freeway analogy, that you're building guardrails either side of the freeway. And that's your upper and lower control limits, your guardrails. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get people to go through the flow of the freeway. But what we've done is we've decided we're going to paint white lines, and we've told people to do the speed, and we've also told them that you must indicate 3 seconds in advance before changing lanes. But in reality, the freeway is just chaos. People are nicely changing lanes. There are no white lines. People are able to change lanes, and for some reason, they can do that without hitting each other as they flow through. Yet we try and focus on trying to control everything, rather than saying, why don't we understand how people navigate that chaos so well? And how can we adjust those guardrails so rather than being a straight road, those guardrails are always curving and it looks more like a sine wave because it's moving up, it's moving down, it's flowing. And do you think COVID has proven to us that concepts like just in time, these concepts of doing everything in the moment, in the present, doesn't function well when there's a major shift or change in systems? Actually, we're going back now to being. Do you think we're going back to being more innovative as a result of COVID?
I really don't have a clue. Perhaps in some areas, perhaps not in others, and I don't think that just in time and all that is necessarily bad. It just hasn't to be applied in every situation as people try. I think it should be restricted to a few very controlled situations, and then you have to be mindful that stuff like COVID can happen, because probably no one really saw that coming. We all knew, well, it was possible, and perhaps in SARS a few years ago. But then you have to be prepared that your controlled system will be out of control for a while. And how do you get it back? So you need to be prepared for that.
But that, I think, just in time, works, right? But what I see with, some organizations is that they jump onto a tool and then try to apply it across everything. And I don't think that works. Or multiple organizations apply. They go, oh, there's a really good tool. It works for Toyota. Let's put it in over here. And there's all sorts of cultural, organizational differences that are not the same. And we need to take that into account. And that's why, I see people talk about safety and, this works here. Well, that's great. Fantastic. We should understand how that works. But it might not work everywhere, and not one size will fit all. And we've got to get away from trying to apply that, in my mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is Deming again. Deming said you have to understand the theory behind stuff, and Perhaps he should have said you need to understand the context and all that, not just copy the rituals. As you, for example, see, you mentioned lean earlier on. When I see a lot of lean implementations, well, that they just copy the Kanban board and they have stand-up sessions and stuff like that. So they do the rituals and then they think, now we're doing lean.
Yes.
No, you're doing not. and you're not even realizing or reflect about whether lean is suitable for you, because if you have an administrative organization that works with, well, not with products as such, but more with knowledge, how can you apply lean? Well, you probably can apply some aspects of it, but not in the copy Toyota way.
No, I always get amazed that, I've been into knowledge-based organizations and they go, oh, we've done a 5S. I don't understand how that even works in your organization, actually. You can sort everything you want, but if they're saying to me that we're getting rid of waste, we've got a procedure and we've found that it's wasteful, we're ticking more boxes than we need to, or more document, then okay, cool, you're removing non-value adding activity, fantastic. So if it's pure sense as that, I think that can make sense. But I've seen as many lean implementations fail as succeed, because people, and again, it comes back to leadership. Sometimes they go, we're going to be a lean organization, and then that leader moves on and it just dissipates. It's not very sustainable, I guess. It's about sustainability.
And you see the same with all these culture things. People go out and then, DuPont does have a great culture, so let's copy what they do.
Yeah.
And then or follow some standard. In the Netherlands, where I grew up, they have now implemented the certification on the safety culture ladder. The maturity model by Hudson and Reason or Fleming, what version you choose. They have actually taken the hearts and minds model of Shell and then transformed it into some kind of nearly ISO standard.
Wow.
And I ask companies to be certified on it. And you need to be certified on a certain level in order to get some work. What does that do with both your culture and the function of a tool like this? It just, it boggles my mind, and it's one of the reasons that I wrote this new book to rally a bit about practices like these.
Right. So you're but the anarchist. It's I understand, because look, and if people aren't showing the alternative, I mean, we're really good at putting people down at the moment. I see at the moment, I see quite often, Carsten, that we're seeing this thing about, the science of safety. We're having this debate about, does everything have to be driven by science? A lot of the work that we've done in the past has come from adult education principles around engaging, and about how to get workers involved, how workers can lead things, because workers have the best knowledge and information, they're the experts, and how can the organization support them? And we're using adult education principles to do that. Do we need science to validate that? Or are we using the principles from adult education that have been around for, hundreds of years?
Which maybe are not science. Yeah, you earlier said that there is the art and there is the science. And I think there should be a good mixture of the two. And probably the art has some science aspect in it, but it's much more than what is generally seen as science, because you can also ask what science is it then? Should it be the measurable kind of natural science, which then is preferred? I think that's one of the drivers that people try to measure everything. Or should it be, more the humanitarian kind of science, where you approach things more descriptive and qualitative? And one of my journeys is more towards that kind. I'm also an engineer by education, and then I've just drifted towards the other end now.
Yeah, just as Brent Robinson came from an engineering background, I came from a systems analyst background, where we behaved quite differently in that when we were designing systems back in the 1980s, computers were super expensive. So you didn't want people to break the computer. So you actually built the system based on how people do things, and that you spent your time to understand how they do things. And then you designed a concept called error trapping, which was allowing users to get it wrong, but then getting it wrong didn't then result in the failure of the computer. So maybe that was some very early concepts about allowing people to fail safely at that time, because, computers were super expensive in that way. So you put, it's fair to say that we had this hierarchy, that the person that did the design was there to map out all the context and the narrative, and then the coders picked that up, and then they did the labor. And then you would test and evaluate that with the users to make sure it was actually effective through their eyes, not through the eyes of the analyst or the coder.
Okay. I've just read Design of Everyday Things by Dan Norman. So you actually did all what he says.
Back in the 80s.
Back in the 80s, when he wrote his book the first time. So
yeah, but that's how we got trained. That's exactly how we got trained, was to basically do that, because it was about being effective and efficient. And we got trained to spend all your time in trying to understand the problem, not trying to fix it.
Would you, now just a spontaneous thought, would you say that here the technological development has actually worked a bit counter? Because with the cheaper computers, I remember how lean my first computer was, because we had this limited disk space. Mm-hmm. So you just got rid of all the wasted space on your computer to get more on it that you wanted to use. And nowadays, you have computers with huge hard drives and a lot of memory, and it looks to me, and I'm no programmer, that programmers are just lazy and have a lot of code that doesn't need to be there.
Yeah, no,
and also you have all these weird errors that you have to update your system all the time.
Yeah. So all systems was always focused about optimizing. So you had to design it to be absolutely optimal, because you didn't have that buffer. You didn't have that flexibility to do that. So you would write sorting programs, indexing programs to maximize efficiency by understanding the user. Now it doesn't matter anymore. Just let clutter just become normal.
But I think that's also a change in the way that we do things as well, because several years ago I ran a problem-solving program with a group of people in Knowledge. It was around the budget that the yearly budget that they would produce. And we went onto the servers and we looked at last year's Excel spreadsheet for the budget. And across the servers and across the hard drives, we found over 40 copies of the same budget. And it had just been saved numerous times by different people with, .br, .cs, and everybody had their own copy. And there was multiple versions of truth there. And, I think as users, we've got lazy as well, because we copy and go, oh yeah, I've got so much disk space, I don't care. I'll put it in the cloud. I think that's leading to it, but we create more information than we can possibly ever use. And I think that's true of safety. So I think of the amount of checklists and documents that we produce in the safety space at the moment, and I have no idea what they're doing. which sort of leads me to your other book, which is if you can't measure it, maybe you shouldn't, because we place a lot of emphasis on we've done this many of something this month, safety walks, whatever it may be. I'm not sure that that's actually along the way. Obviously, you did a lot of work in looking at that to try and understand that and start that conversation.
Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We would love to hear your learnings or other topics you would like us to explore about learning teams. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and give us your feedback. Become part of the community of practice with learning teams. Go to www.learningteamscommunity.com. Support the authors of the practice of learning teams. Purchase the book from Amazon.com or go to www.learningteamsbook.com for an inside look and other free book resources from the authors.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.